Welcome back to Decoding Communication. This is session 3, and we're going to continue with our decoding of one of the world's greatest mysteries of all, and that's the communication between a man and a woman, between a husband and wife. In sessions 1 and 2, we dealt with the differences between boys and girls and men and women. We shared about how we can get stuck in this crazy cycle that can lead to divorce, which is epidemic not only in the world, but in the Christian church today. Listen up, wives. In this session, in the next 3 sessions actually, we're going to talk about decoding the mind of man, or understanding the mind of a male. I think you're going to find this very interesting, and for some of you guys, you're going to say, I always kind of thought that way, but I really didn't know that that's really what was happening in my head. And I think you'll find it not only entertaining, but convicting. First of all, we need to understand, men are providers. They are hunters. They are protectors. They are pursuers. They are fixers. In other words, men tend to be logical in their thinking, and they want to see a problem, and they logically want to try to solve it and try to figure out what's going on. And of course, down inside, men won't admit this, but they don't want to be a king. Really what they want to be is a prince. And you know what? Men usually live by the honor code. Now, as I talk about this, what I'm talking about is not evil men, not men who are bent on wickedness and abusiveness, but I'm talking about generally good-willed men. And now, we know there's always exceptions to the rules. There's always going to be a guy that doesn't fit in the mold. But as you generally look at men, we see that there's definitely a difference between men and women. I travel quite a bit, and one of the things that I find interesting is that that of movies. I see movies on airplanes, and in fact, I have a lot of non-Christian relatives, and I go to their homes sometimes, and I'm exposed to, just regular commercial television, and I talk with young people, and of course, a lot of young people like to talk about movies. And one of the things that I've noticed is that when you talk to men and you talk to women, you can see there's a distinct difference about the kind of movies they like. Now, there's some crossover, there's always exceptions to the rules, but men generally like the action movies, the hero stories, the war movies, or some kind of sports, something that has to do with, Coach Carter or something like that, while the girls or the women, they tend towards more the love stories. We have a phrase here in the United States, we call it chick flicks. When I was in Australia and I was sharing some of this information, they'd never heard that term before, chick flicks. It's kind of a little bit of a slang, but the girls lean towards sentimental stories. Now, there are some girls who like to watch horror movies or sci-fi, or they like to watch, some of these other kind of movies, and I'm talking about in the secular world, just looking at men and women generally in the West. But you can see the difference between men and women just by the kind of movies that they like to watch. Now, there's a difference there. And just because there's a difference, it doesn't mean that the men are better than the women or the women are better than the men. It just shows that there's a difference. It's not wrong, it's just different. Okay, ladies, are you ready for this? I'm going to show you an illustration here. I'm going to show you the mind of a male. Okay, here it is. Yep, that's it. A one-track mind. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. I have never yet, and I've done a lot of traveling in different places, in Australia, New Zealand, around the world, in the United States, in inner city areas, and I've been on the freeway, and never once have I seen a man driving down the freeway, trimming his beard in the mirror, talking on his cell phone at the same time, changing the radio stations with a cup of cappuccino between his legs and steering with his knee. You just don't normally see that. In fact, here in North Idaho, which is kind of a logging community, if you see a truck pulled off the side of the road, it means one of two things. Either there's poor reception in the area, and that's where you can get a cell signal, or it means the guy is just simply talking on his cell phone because he can't drive and talk on his cell phone at the same time. And it's just something about men. Women are multitaskers. They can do things better. God designed them to be mothers, take care of children, and they are able to just do all kinds of different things. That's why women oftentimes make very, very good secretaries. But here's another picture, ladies. The other picture of the mind of a man. Yep, that's it. It's a door into a room. See, men have this ability to compartmentalize. Men can open a door and go into a room, and that's just focused. This one-track mind mentality of going into a room and focusing on whatever they're doing there, and then they can go out of that room, shut the door, go down the hall, open another door, and go into another room. And see, this tends to have men be able to stuff thoughts and feelings away. I mean, have you ever had a discussion with your husband and all of a sudden he just gets quiet and he goes off in the other room, gets on the computer and starts doing something, and you're like, what's going on with him? You know, we were having a discussion, and all of a sudden now he's focused on something else. Or maybe he's writing a letter on an email or something, and the wife tries to talk to him, and he's like, he can't talk right now because he's focused on this. You know, men have a tendency to compartmentalize. You know, that is a real great strength. In fact, if I was going to have our city be invaded, I mean, if I was going to have to make a choice on who was going to protect our city if we were being invaded, I would rather have a group of 20 to 25-year-old young men guarding our city than a group of 25 to 20-year-old women guarding our city, because men can compartmentalize, and by this that means that they can focus on something, tune everything out, and just be focused on the objective of what they need to do. And that's not to say that there's this difference between men and women, that one's better than the other. It just shows that there's this tendency that men have, you know, like in 9/11, the men that went in and saved people even to their death in the Twin Towers, they could tune out everything, and they went into their death to basically try to be saving somebody in those Twin Towers. They were so focused and compartmentalized that they tuned everything else out, and they went in there with the objective on trying to save somebody. Now, every strength has its back-sided weakness. Now, as a man may be able to compartmentalize and tune things out, and he can go in and be the hero and save people, it also causes him to tune out other issues. You know, he can open one door and shut the other, and sometimes that can be very frustrating for a wife. And understanding is, how can he do this? My wife is like, it's not fair that men are made this way, because she's got all these pop-up windows, and we're going to talk about that in the sessions, dealing with the mind of a woman. But, you know, a woman will have all these pop-up windows and all these thoughts happening at the same time, where a guy oftentimes is just, you know, thinking down one line. And by the way, this affects the way that men communicate. Now I'm going to show you an illustration of the male way of communicating. This is it. See that line? That's how men communicate. Because men have focused communication to share information. Men usually interface with each other for one purpose, and that is to share information. They don't spider web off all different directions and talk about all different things and come around in a big circle and land. They usually are just sharing information. It's a guy thing. You know, to give you an illustration, there was this young couple that just were married. They'd been married for 2 years. They had one car, and they needed to get a second car. And so they had talked about buying a second car, and they had some money saved up, and they checked into the finances and being able to get a loan to pay for the rest of the car. And so the husband was in pursuit. He's the hunter, you know, he's looking for a car. And so in his pursuit, he's looking through the newspapers and checking different ads and stuff. At the same time, his wife is having some emotional issues that she's struggling with. And she's thinking to herself, you know, did I really marry the right guy? Here she is just a young gal. She's only been married for 2 years. And she did like a lot of young girls do, you know, or even older ladies. She got together with some of her girlfriends and started sharing with them about, you know, I made this decision, until death do we part. You know, is this Mr. Right? Is this the guy who I'm supposed to spend the rest of my life with? I mean, is this really the man who I should spend all my life with? Did I make the right choice? You know, I'm just having all these feelings that I'm dealing with, that I don't know if this was really right. And one of her girlfriends gave her some counsel. She said, you know, you need to just sit down and talk with your husband, get it out in the open, express your feelings, vent yourself, and get closure on this matter so you can move forward and you can put the effort into your relationship that you should. And she thought to herself, that's a great idea, that's what I'm going to do. So that evening she came home and she was in the kitchen cooking, and her husband was in the living room and he was looking through the classified ads, looking at trying to find a new used car. And she started thinking, this is it. I have to talk to my husband. I need to talk to him about this issue. I got to resolve this. I have to have closure. I have to express to him my feelings. And kabump, 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 her heart's pounding in her chest. And she goes to the kitchen door and she's looking in the living room and says, honey, I need to talk with you. And he puts the newspaper down and he says, what's that? And she says, well, you know, I've just been thinking about this whole thing, about you and me, and, you know, this whole thing that we've been discussing and what's been going on in our lives. And I mean, was this really meant to be? I mean, can you and I do this? I mean, can we pull this off? I mean, really, was this meant to be? And he's sitting there looking at her and he's thinking, wow, she's sure getting worked up about buying a car. You know, I've gone over with her about the finances and about how we can get a low interest rate loan and how we have money saved up. I just don't understand why she's so concerned. So he looks at her and says, honey, yes, this was meant to be. We can do this. We can pull it off. You and I can do this. And she comes over and she sits down next to her husband and says, you sure? You're sure that we can do this? I just need to have closure on this whole thing. I just, want to know that, you and me and this whole thing was meant to be. And he looked at her and he says, honey, we can do it. We can do it. We can pull this off. This was meant to be. We can do it. Don't worry about it, honey. I love you. And she just melted. She hugged her husband and she kissed him. And she started going off towards the kitchen and she's like, I have closure now. She was feeling wonderful. And her husband said, oh, honey, by the way, I have one question for you. And she said, what's that? I was just wondering, do you think we should get a standard transmission or we should get an automatic? And then all of a sudden she realized that they were not communicating. You see, men are often dealing with facts. They're in their little compartment. You've heard the expression before, wow, it seems like he just doesn't get it. Well, sometimes men just don't get it because men are in their little compartment focused on the facts of what they're thinking about that time. And women are often dealing with their emotions and their feelings and such. It's not wrong. It's just different. Here's an interesting statement by a female author. It's summarizing men and women. You wives out there, listen to this, because I could just read this one quote and we could just stop the program right now and this would be our counsel for today if we could just live by it in our relationships. Listen to what this doctor says. She says, men are basically very simple creatures. Men are admittedly putty in the hands of a woman they love. Give them direct communication, respect, appreciation, food, and good loving, and he'll do just about anything you wish, foolish or not. That comes from the book by Dr. Laura Schlesinger called The Proper Care and Feeding of Husbands. Now I want to talk to you about something that's kind of sensitive. Some of you might disagree with this. It's a matter of fact that in the late 1800s, early 1900s, that women were somewhat oppressed. They didn't have equal rights with men. But society today has flip-flopped to a large degree, and there is what we could say in society, and I don't think any of us could probably deny this, that there is a radical feminist agenda that is loose in inner city areas. And along with this comes the unisex movement, which has affected the distinction between men and women. And this has affected many different things in our culture. When I say our culture, I'm talking about Europe, the Americas, and also in places like Australia and New Zealand. First of all, our culture and even a lot of churches have adopted a strategy that facilitates the feminization of men. In other words, there is not a distinction being made in Sunday school classes and Sabbath school classes about things that pertain to the way boys should behave and the way that girls should be behaved. It's more of a unisex type of message that oftentimes is portrayed within our culture and, like I say, even amongst our churches. And in that, when you look at little boys and how rowdy they are and how sometimes out of control, there's a difference between boys and girls. I have 3 daughters and 1 boy. When I had the 2 girls and then finally we had the boy, I often told people that my 1 son was equivalent to taking care of 2 girls when they're small. There's a definite difference between boys and girls. But masculinity, with its fondness to adventure and to rowdiness and risk, has become kind of a condition that some people think should be cured, that little boys just shouldn't do that. And then we wonder why boys grow up to be young men and then they get involved with, trying to prove their masculinity in the inner city areas by getting involved with gangs and violence and different things, because there's this thing that God's put inside of them about adventure and being men that crops out in the wrong way because it's been suppressed, and then it goes off into society that direction. And on the other hand, there's a lot of boys that are suppressed that they should be just nice little boys, and they are feminized, and then we wonder why there's rampant homosexuality prevalent in our society today. Consequently, boys are in big trouble in the school systems and in even some churches because they have not taken in the unique features of masculinity, considering and designing curriculums or programs. And I know this to be a fact because I worked in the public school district for quite a number of years, and I saw what was happening there with the things being taught in classes. Now, you stop and think about between the ages of kindergarten to the 7th grade, are the majority of the teachers men or women? The majority of the teachers are female, and they deal with things in the classroom from a female perspective. And our culture is also intent on emasculating its boys, and because of this, it's produced a sense of withdrawal and boredom from its men. Go to inner city areas and look at a lot of guys. They have withdrawn from society. They come home from work and just plop down on the sofa and just watch television. They're bored. They have no adventure in their life. It seems like they have nothing driving them in society to go out and accomplish or achieve things. This is kind of a sensitive point too, but as disconcerting as it may be to mothers, masculinity can only be imparted by masculinity. In other words, a young boy is never really sure that he's become a man until another man or a group of men, show him or tell him so. And in a situation where divorce is so high, and there's a lot of single parent homes, there's a lot of young boys that are growing up with mothers who are doing their best, their God-given best to try to be a mother and a father to these young boys, but they really can't be a guy. And so these young boys need the masculine role models in their lives. And also, sadly, and in many cases, men who are in the homes have neglected their responsibility of passing on masculinity to their sons. Down inside, God has put something in us. God has put a battle to fight inside of men, an adventure to live and a beauty to rescue. Men have a battle to fight and they want to be achievers, and they want to set goals in their life, and they want to move forward and do something. They want to have an adventure. And you know what? They want to find that beauty to rescue. And down inside women, what they want to have is to be fought for. Women want to be pursued by a man. I remember when I was dating my girlfriend, who is now my wife, years ago, she loved it when I called her on the phone. I come looking for her. I pursued her. That was something she really loved. And she, down inside, just like a lot of women, wanted to have an adventure to share with a husband and wife together, sharing an adventure of life together. And more than anything, down inside, she wanted to be beautiful. Men are hunters. Women are shoppers. Now, this really comes out in kind of a very obvious way in my own life. I know that a while back we went out to get some gifts for some friends, and my wife took me to this large store that was attached to a big shopping mall. And a lot of guys dread going with their wives to shopping malls. There are exceptions to the rules, and there are guys that like to get together with the guys and they go do guy shopping, looking at cars or going to sporting goods stores and that kind of stuff. But generally speaking, men are hunters. And so my wife and I go to this really cool store that has all kinds of really neat things in it that are gadgets for kitchens and household appliances and decorating and all that stuff. And we went into the store. My wife went one way, I went another way, and I was on a military operation. I mean, what I did was I went and I scoped out the whole store. I went up and down every aisle and everything. I found the sections that had the things in it that I was interested in. I went back and I looked at the gizmos over in this area and the kitchen appliances over in that area. I picked up a few things. I was at the checkout counter, and my wife was in the first aisle still shopping, still looking for something to buy. And I was sitting out in the car going, oh boy, we're going to be here for a long, long time. You see, men are hunters, women are shoppers. There's a story that was told, it's a true story, that is told by Dr. Egerich. And he talks about a lady who was out shopping one day, and she went into a bookstore and she found this book on how to have a more fulfilling Christian marriage. And she opened this book up and she started looking at it, and she immediately went to the counter and purchased this book. And as she was going through the book at home, she was taking a yellow highlighter and she was marking different things in there, and she was thinking, oh, if my husband would only read this. And then she was turning the pages as she was reading and dog-earing some of the pages. Oh, if my husband would only read that. And she went through the whole book. Oh, my husband needs to read this book. And so she did what she thought was wise. She went and set the book down very carefully on a little stand next to his favorite chair in the living room. And she was explaining this whole thing to Dr. Egerich in a counseling session. She said, my husband never even picked up the book. He never even looked at it. And he says, how do you know that? How do you know when you were out of the room that maybe he picked it up and flipped through it? And you know what she said? She measured the book. She'd laid the book precisely a certain way. She said there was dust on it, and she measured it. She said, he didn't pick it up. And he said, well, what'd you do then? She said, well, then I put the book by the nightstand in the bedroom. I thought maybe he might pick it up and read it then. She said, he never touched it. She said, I finally even resorted putting the book by the toilet in the bathroom, thinking that maybe her husband would pick it up. And Dr. Egerich, he says, look, just a second here, just a second. I want to just stop the story right here. I want you to think about something. And what he did was he took and he twisted the whole story. He said, now let's suppose your husband, he's being thoughtful, the kind of guy that he is, he's being thoughtful about you, and he knows that over the holidays that you picked up a few pounds and you expressed it to him that you didn't feel very good about yourself and that you put on some weight and that you kind of, were struggling with this whole thing. And so, he's being a thoughtful, nice guy that he is, and he's in this bookstore and he sees this special sale on dieting for the Christian woman. 23 recipes for the holidays that are guaranteed to be low fat. And he says, wow, this book, my wife would really appreciate it. He starts flipping through it and he thinks, wow, this is a wonderful book. And being a sensitive guy, he has the book gift wrapped and puts a red ribbon on it for his wife. And he goes home and he walks in and his wife sees this package and she's just elated. Her spirit is like picked up, and he hands the book to her and she opens it up and she's wondering what this is, and she sees dieting for the Christian woman. And she looks at the book and she goes, you bought this for me? You're saying I'm ugly and I'm overweight? You don't love me anymore? Why, you're so cruel. Men are so insensitive. Why would you buy a book like this for me? I can't believe you did this. And the lady's going, yeah, that's exactly how I feel. You see, what she was thinking was this. When she looked at the book, she was thinking her husband was saying, I do not accept you. I do not approve of you. And I do not love you unless you look like a movie star. And then he said, now take a thought about this. In a man's mind, when he comes home and he's sitting at his favorite chair and he looks down and he sees the book on how to have the perfect Christian marriage, he has 3 thoughts come to his mind. And you see, men are performance-oriented. I mean, and we're going to share this in our next session about how men are so insecure about their performance and how they're perceived to be providers. But basically, he looks at this book and he says, and he thinks that this is what you're thinking. I do not accept you. And I do not approve of you, and I do not respect you, buddy, unless you read this book right now and you start getting our marriage in line. And he feels inadequate. He feels like he can't, meet up to his wife's expectations, so he doesn't even bother to crack the page. With guys, this whole thing about respect is a big issue. And when he sees this book, he feels disrespected. He feels he's not measuring up. He's not doing good enough. We have shown that men have a weakness in showing love as God commands men to do it. In fact, we need to remember that every one of his promises, every one of his commands are actually enablings. And in the same sense, love comes more natural to a female, but not respect. And so God commands in Ephesians 5:33, nevertheless, let every one of you in particular so love his wife even as himself, and the wife see that she reverence or respect her husband. Here's a command by God. You go over to 1 Peter chapter 3, 1 and 2. It says, likewise, you wives, be in subjection to your own husbands, that if any obey not the word, they also may without the word be won by the conversation of the wives, while they behold your chaste conversation coupled with fear. Now here's some insight for you ladies from the Word of God. God is revealing to you the power to be able to tap into the heart of a man. The language of a man is respect. And so by understanding that in this verse, it's basically saying, in the verse of 1 Peter, it's saying that even though your husband doesn't deserve it, even though your husband is an unbeliever, you don't need to say anything. If you just speak the language of respect to him, you can win his heart. You can unlock his heart. You can draw him closer to you, and you can even win him to the Lord by following the injunction that God has given. God has given you, ladies, a key to the heart and the mind of man. And we need to accept God's culture and not the culture of the world. The culture of the world today is basically coming from a feminist agenda that's saying, if you do these things and you show respect to a man, basically what you're doing is you're feeding his male ego, and really what we need to do is knock this male ego down a few notches. And I'm going to share with you in the upcoming sessions that how fragile and how insecure men are down inside about the way they feel about themselves, and how a wife can push a husband down and make a husband feel demoralized because she doesn't understand the way that a man thinks about himself. And this whole thing is that God's designed women one way and men another way, and these two differences are to come together to become one flesh. And in doing that, the two together are to reflect the glory of God. And instead what happens is these two differences end up polarizing against each other and end up brick by brick creating a wall of separation that ends up causing alienation in a relationship and finally divorce. We pointed out in previous sessions, love is a big issue for women. It's her language. And we're going to talk about that in up-and-coming sessions. We're going to have a 3-part session dealing with understanding the mind of a woman and speaking the language of love. Respect is a big issue for men. It's their language. As we continue on understanding the mind of a man, I will share with you how you can win a man's heart. Ladies, you need to understand how to speak the language of respect. You need to understand how your husband's mind is working and how he feels about himself and his relationship with you. And by doing so, by claiming God's promises and doing what God's asked you to do, you can be empowered and motivate and empower your husband to be the kind of husband you would want him to be. I know that when my wife and I started going through some of this material, we were tremendously blessed. And as she started adapting some of these things in our marriage relationship, it really, really helped us to become team members on the same page, trying to work together in our relationship with each other and with our kids. And I just want to share with you that these Decoding Communication series can help you to unlock this mystery between the communication between a husband and wife. In our next session, we're going to be talking about speaking the language of respect. There's going to be part 1 and part 2. God bless you till the next session.